boy returns from the grave with a shocking truth about angels. Samuel's fascination with angels had always been innocent, a child's curiosity fueled by the colorful illustrations in his grandmother's Bible. He would sit cross-legged on the living room floor, sketching angelic figures with wide, feathered wings and golden halos, always asking the same question: do they really look like this? His grandmother would chuckle softly, running a hand through his dark hair. "Oh, Sammy, angels are much more beautiful than we can imagine. They're God's messengers, His protectors. You don't need to be afraid of them." But the angels Samuel encountered that day were nothing like his grandmother's descriptions. The accident happened on a humid summer afternoon. Samuel had been playing by the riverbank with his older brother, Mark, tossing flat rocks across the murky water to see who could skip them the furthest. The river was swollen from days of rain, its current stronger and faster than usual, but neither boy paid much attention. They were too engrossed in their game, their laughter echoing through the trees. Samuel's foot slipped on the wet grass, and before he could regain his balance, he tumbled down the steep embankment. He landed with a splash, the icy water pulling him under before he had a chance to cry out. Mark shouted his name, scrambling to the edge of the river, but Samuel was already gone, swept away by the raging current. The world beneath the surface was cold and chaotic. Samuel flailed his arms, desperate to find something to grab onto, but the water carried him deeper, spinning him like a rag doll. His lungs burned as he held his breath, his chest tightening as the darkness closed in around him. He felt something sharp scrape against his leg, a submerged branch or a jagged rock, but the pain was distant, muffled by the overwhelming sensation of drowning. Then, everything stopped. The water was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of blinding white light. Samuel felt weightless, as though he were floating in an ocean of air. He opened his eyes, or thought he did, but the light was so intense that it erased everything else. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. Just light. At first, he thought he was alone. But then he saw them. They didn't appear all at once. Their forms emerged slowly, as if they were stepping out of the light itself. Towering figures with countless wings and burning, unblinking eyes. Their bodies shifted constantly, their shapes impossible to comprehend. Where one moment Samuel saw hands, the next there were talons, or feathers, or something else entirely. They radiated power, their presence so overwhelming that Samuel's body felt like it was being crushed beneath their gaze. He couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The only sound was the deafening hum that seemed to emanate from the figures, a vibration that filled the space around him. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, it was something deeper, something that resonated in his bones and his mind. One of the figures stepped closer, or maybe it didn't move at all. The distance between them simply disappeared. Its many eyes turned toward Samuel, and in that instant he understood that this being saw everything. Every thought, every memory, every secret. He was utterly exposed, his existence laid bare before something far beyond his comprehension. "You should not be here." The voice wasn't a voice. It was a cacophony, 1,000 tones overlapping, each one speaking a different truth. The words didn't form in Samuel's ears, they formed in his mind, cutting through his thoughts like a blade. He tried to speak, to ask where he was, but the words dissolved before they reached his lips. The figure tilted its head, or maybe it didn't have a head, Samuel couldn't tell. "This place is not for you." He felt himself being pulled backward, the light growing dimmer, the figures fading into the distance. But just before they vanished, one of the beings reached out, its many-fingered hand stretching toward him. Samuel's heart raced as he watched it draw closer, the space around him warping as the hand brushed against his chest. The touch was cold. Cold and sharp and endless. It wasn't a touch meant for human skin. It was something alien, something that carried with it the weight of eternity. The hum grew louder, and for a brief moment, Samuel thought he could see something beyond the light. Something darker. Something waiting. And then he was falling. The white light gave way to a kaleidoscope of color, then to blackness. He felt his body hit something solid, cold, wet, and unyielding. His chest convulsed, and water poured from his mouth as he gasped for air, his lungs burning with every ragged breath. Voices, Hands. A blur of faces above him. Samuel. Oh my God, Samuel. It was his mother's voice, shrill and panicked, cutting through the haze of pain and confusion. He felt her arms around him, pulling him close, her tears soaking into his hair. Mark was there too, his face pale and streaked with dirt, his hands shaking as he hovered nearby. He's breathing, someone said, a man's voice, deep and unfamiliar. We've got a pulse. Let's get him to the ambulance. Samuel tried to speak, but his throat was raw, his body trembling violently. He couldn't form words, couldn't explain what he had seen. The figures, the light, the hand that had touched him. It was too much. But as he was lifted onto the stretcher, he managed to whisper 3 words, his voice barely audible. They're not angels. The paramedics exchanged confused glances, but his mother shushed him gently, stroking his hair. It's okay, baby, she said, her voice trembling. You're safe now. You're going to be okay. Samuel wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe he was safe. But he could still feel the touch of that hand on his chest, cold and infinite, and he knew the truth. He wasn't safe. None of them were. Samuel's nightmares began the moment he closed his eyes. He hadn't wanted to sleep that first night back from the hospital, but his body gave out before his mind could protest. As soon as he drifted off, he was back in that blinding expanse of light. The figures towered over him again, their forms shifting and impossible, their countless wings stretching in every direction. The hum returned, vibrating through his chest, louder this time, more urgent. They spoke in unison, their voices drilling into his mind. You are marked. Samuel woke with a scream, his body drenched in sweat. He clutched his chest, his fingers digging into the spot where the being had touched him. His skin felt normal, warm, smooth, but he could still feel the cold echo of that hand, a ghostly sensation that wouldn't fade. His mother burst into the room, panic etched into her face. Samuel, what's wrong? He couldn't find the words. How could he explain what he had seen, what he had felt? That the creatures his grandmother had called angels weren't protectors or messengers of God. They were watchers, enforcers, entities that existed far beyond human comprehension. And they were terrifying. It was just a dream, he lied, his voice trembling. I'm okay. His mother didn't look convinced, but she sat on the edge of his bed, smoothing his damp hair away from his forehead. You've been through a lot, she said softly. It's normal to feel scared. But you're safe now. The word felt meaningless. Samuel knew better. He wasn't safe. And the worst part was, he couldn't tell anyone the truth. They wouldn't believe him. The strange occurrences started the next day. It began with the lights. At first, it was subtle, a flicker here, a dimming there. But as the day wore on, it became more pronounced. The kitchen lights buzzed and blinked erratically while Samuel ate breakfast, casting strange shadows on the walls. His mother blamed the wiring, though the house had never had electrical issues before. Then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator or the rustling of leaves outside. But they grew louder as the day went on, a chorus of overlapping voices speaking in a language Samuel didn't understand. He heard them when he was alone in his room, when he walked through the hallway, even when he was surrounded by his family. They were everywhere, always just out of reach. And then there were the shadows. Samuel first noticed them that evening as he stared out his bedroom window. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, but the shadows beneath the trees seemed too dark, too solid. They moved unnaturally, slithering across the ground like living things. He blinked, hoping it was just his imagination, but they were still there when he opened his eyes. And they were watching him. He backed away from the window, his heart racing. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls too close. He turned toward the door, but before he could reach it, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the small desk lamp he had left on. The whispers surged, louder now, filling his ears, his mind. You are marked. The next morning, Samuel's father turned on the news as the family sat down for breakfast. The anchor's voice was strained, her usual polished demeanor cracked as she reported on a growing phenomenon sweeping the globe. Reports have emerged from several countries of strange, unexplained sightings, she said, her face pale. Witnesses describe tall, humanoid figures with wings and glowing eyes appearing in remote areas and major cities alike. Scientists are baffled, offering no explanation for the phenomena, while religious leaders are divided on what it means. The screen cut to shaky cell phone footage of a figure standing on a rooftop, its silhouette blurred and indistinct. Its wings stretched wide, each feather shimmering with an otherworldly glow. The camera jerked as the person recording gasped and stumbled, the image going black. Samuel froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He recognized the figure, not the specific one, but the kind. It was one of them, one of the Watchers. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "What's that, sweetie?" his mother asked, distracted as she poured coffee. "Nothing," he said quickly, lowering his gaze. But his mind was racing. If they were appearing in the world of the living, it meant something had changed. Something was happening. And then the news anchor said something that made Samuel's blood run cold. The White House has issued a statement, urging calm and dismissing the sightings as mass hysteria. President Trump addressed the nation this morning, saying, "We've seen strange things before, folks, but let me tell you, there's nothing to worry about. We've got the best people looking into this, and we're going to get answers." The broadcast cut to footage of Trump standing at a podium, his face uncharacteristically serious. "I know people are scared," he said, his voice steady but lacking its usual bravado. "But we've faced challenges before, and we've come out stronger. This is no different. We're going to get through this together." Samuel couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. He wanted to believe the president's words, to feel reassured. But the memory of the Watcher's cold, unblinking eyes haunted him. This wasn't a challenge humanity could overcome. This wasn't something science or politics could fix. This was something far bigger, far older, and far more terrifying. That night, Samuel's nightmares returned. The Watchers stood in a circle around him, their wings folding and unfolding in an endless, rhythmic pattern. Their eyes glowed like molten gold, and their voices echoed in his mind. "You cannot run." He woke with a start, gasping for air. But this time, he wasn't alone. A shadowy figure stood at the foot of his bed, its form indistinct, its presence suffocating. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Samuel felt its gaze boring into him, freezing him in place. He blinked and it was gone. The next morning, Samuel discovered something new. A mark, faint but undeniable, had appeared on his chest, right where the Watcher had touched him. It glowed faintly in the dark, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He covered it with his shirt, his hands trembling. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't finished with him. Samuel kept the mark hidden, but it felt like it was burning into his skin. He couldn't stop checking it, pulling his shirt aside when no one was looking, only to see the faint glow intensify when he touched it. It didn't hurt, not exactly. It felt more like a constant pressure, as if it were pressing against his soul rather than his body. He stopped mentioning the Watchers to his family. They were already walking on eggshells around him, his mother treating him like fragile glass and his father retreating into long silences. Mark, his older brother, tried to act normal, but Samuel saw the way his eyes darted to him when he thought he wasn't looking. No one said it outright, but they all thought the same thing. The accident had broken him. But Samuel knew better. He wasn't broken, he was being watched. The Watchers didn't just stay in his dreams. They started appearing in the corners of his vision, at the edges of his awareness. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting shadow that disappeared when he turned his head, the faint sound of wings rustling when no one else was around. But soon they grew bolder. One night as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the room grew unnaturally cold. His breath came out in puffs of mist, and the familiar hum returned, low and vibrating through his chest. He sat up slowly, his heart pounding, and there it was, standing at the foot of his bed. The Watcher. It was taller than he remembered, its form stretching unnaturally as it loomed over him. Its wings were massive, their edges sharp and glinting in the dim light. Its eyes burned like molten gold, unblinking, and its body shifted constantly, as though it were made of smoke and light. Samuel wanted to scream, but the sound caught in his throat. He pressed himself against the headboard, his body trembling. The Watcher tilted its head, And for a moment, the room was filled with a deafening silence. Then, without moving its mouth, it spoke. "You are marked." The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a single voice. It was a chorus, dozens of overlapping tones that resonated in Samuel's mind, drowning out his own thoughts. "Why?" Samuel managed to whisper, his voice barely audible. "Why me?" The watcher didn't answer. Instead, it extended one of its many hands, if they could be called hands, toward him. The limb was long and skeletal, its surface shimmering like liquid metal. Samuel pressed himself harder against the headboard, his breath quickening. "Do not fight," the voices said. "You have been chosen." Before he could react, the watcher's hand touched the mark on his chest. The pressure he had felt since the accident intensified, exploding into a wave of cold that spread through his entire body. He gasped, his vision going white as the hum reached a deafening pitch. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Samuel blinked, his vision clearing. The watcher was gone. The room was silent, save for the sound of his ragged breathing. But when he looked down at his chest, the mark was different. It was no longer faint, it glowed brightly, its intricate lines spreading outward like veins of fire. The next morning, the world felt wrong. Samuel turned on the television, but every channel was the same: news reports of strange phenomena spreading across the globe. Cities plunged into darkness as massive power outages rolled through entire continents. Unexplained storms tore through areas that hadn't seen rain in decades, while deserts flooded and rivers dried up overnight. But the most terrifying reports were about the figures. "They're calling them angels," one anchor said, her voice trembling. "But these beings, they're not like anything described in the Bible. They're appearing in the skies over major cities, in rural towns, even in people's homes." Witnesses describe them as massive, shifting forms of light and shadow, with wings that stretch for miles. No one knows what they want, but their presence is spreading fear and confusion. The screen cut to footage of one of the beings hovering over a city, its form too bright to look at directly. The camera shook as the person recording it screamed, the image blurring before cutting to black. Samuel's hands shook as he turned off the television. He knew what they wanted. He could feel it. The mark on his chest pulsed in time with his heartbeat, its glow visible even through his shirt. By the end of the day, Samuel could no longer ignore the whispers. They followed him everywhere, growing louder and more insistent. When he walked through the house, they echoed in the walls. When he closed his eyes, they filled his mind. They weren't speaking in words he could understand, but he knew they were calling him. That night, he made a decision. He didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't stay. Not with the watchers closing in. He packed a bag with whatever he could carry, some clothes, a flashlight, a notebook, and a few snacks, and slipped out of the house while his family was asleep. The streets were eerily quiet as he walked, the occasional flicker of streetlights casting long, shifting shadows. He kept his head down, his heart pounding in his chest. But no matter how far he walked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He turned a corner and froze. A watcher stood in the middle of the street, its massive wings folded behind it. It was taller than the buildings around it, its form stretching upward into the night sky. Its eyes glowed brighter than the streetlights, casting long beams of light that seemed to pierce through Samuel. "You cannot run," the voices said, filling the air around him. Samuel's legs trembled, but he forced himself to move. He turned and ran as fast as he could, his bag bouncing against his back. The watcher didn't follow, but its presence lingered, a suffocating weight that pressed down on him with every step. He didn't stop running until he reached the outskirts of town, his lungs burning and his legs ready to give out. He collapsed onto the grass, gasping for air, and looked up at the sky. The stars were gone. In their place were shapes, massive, winged figures that hovered silently, their forms blending with the darkness. There were dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their glowing eyes scattered across the heavens like dying embers. And they were all watching him. Samuel lay on the grass, frozen as the watchers hovered silently in the sky. Their vast, otherworldly forms shifted against the blackness, wings stretching like endless shadows. The glowing eyes that dotted their bodies pulsed in unison, each one fixed on him. He couldn't move, couldn't even think. The sheer weight of their presence crushed every ounce of courage he had left. Then the whispers began again. You cannot hide. You are marked. The time has come. The voices overlapped, a chorus that filled the air and vibrated through the ground beneath him. The mark on his chest burned fiercely, its glow casting eerie patterns on the grass around him. Samuel clutched at it, trying to smother the light, but it was useless. The Watchers weren't just observing, they were summoning him. The ground beneath him began to tremble. The faint vibration grew stronger, the earth cracking and splintering as if the weight of the Watcher's gaze alone was enough to tear it apart. Samuel scrambled to his feet, stumbling backward as the ground split open in front of him, a jagged chasm that pulsed with light. From its depths came the sound of wings, thousands of them, flapping in chaotic unison. And then they rose. Dark, humanoid figures began to emerge from the fissure, their bodies wreathed in shadow. Unlike the towering Watchers, these beings were smaller, their forms more solid, but no less terrifying. Their wings were jagged and broken, their eyes glowing red instead of gold. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as though they were being controlled by unseen strings. Samuel recognized them instantly. They were the Fallen. The Watchers remained motionless above, their cold golden eyes fixed on the scene below. The Fallen spread out across the ground, their movements erratic as they clawed at the earth, their voices shrieking in a language Samuel didn't understand. The air grew colder, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic. Do not look away. Do not close your eyes. They will come. Samuel stumbled backward, his breath coming in short gasps. The Fallen moved like predators, their heads snapping toward him in unison as if they'd caught his scent. Their red eyes locked onto him, and the shrieking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then they attacked. The first Fallen lunged at him, its wings unfurling like a storm of blades. Samuel dove to the side, the creature's claws missing him by inches. He hit the ground hard, pain shooting through his shoulder as he scrambled to his feet. Another Fallen charged, its jagged wings slicing through the air. Samuel ducked, his legs trembling as he turned and ran. The Watchers remained motionless, their golden eyes unblinking as the chaos unfolded below. Samuel could feel their gaze on him, cold and indifferent, as though this was all part of some incomprehensible plan. The Fallen were faster than he was. He could hear their wings beating behind him, the sharp crack of their claws scraping against the ground. The whispers in his mind grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, his instincts. He felt the mark on his chest burning hotter, its glow so intense that it lit up the darkness around him. He tripped, his foot catching on an exposed root. He hit the ground face first, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Before he could get up, he felt the cold, jagged claws of a Fallen wrap around his ankle. It dragged him backward, its strength overwhelming, its breath cold against his skin. Samuel screamed, twisting and kicking with all his might. His foot connected with something solid, and the Fallen released him with a screech that sounded like tearing metal. He scrambled to his feet, his chest heaving as he turned to face the creature. It stood there, its wings spread wide, its body shimmering with an oily black light. Its face was a grotesque parody of humanity, its features stretched and distorted. But its eyes, those glowing red eyes, bored into Samuel, filled with hunger and malice. Samuel backed away, his legs shaking. The other Fallen closed in, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators savoring the hunt. He was surrounded, the circle of twisted, winged figures closing tighter with every step. And then the Watchers moved. One of the towering beings descended from the sky, its massive wings folding as it landed silently behind the Fallen. The earth trembled beneath its weight, and the air grew colder still. The Fallen turned as one, their shrieking voices silenced in the presence of the Watcher. The Watcher raised one of its many hands, and the Fallen froze. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a single, fluid motion, the Watcher struck. Its hand moved like lightning, slicing through the Fallen with an elegance that belied its size. The creatures didn't scream, they simply disintegrated, their bodies dissolving into shadows that were carried away by the wind. The Watcher moved methodically, its movements precise and unrelenting. In seconds, the fallen were gone. Samuel stood frozen, his heart pounding as the Watcher turned its gaze on him. Its golden eyes burned brighter, and the whispers in his mind shifted, their tone colder, more deliberate. "You are marked. You will not escape. The balance must be maintained." Before Samuel could react, the Watcher extended one of its wings. It wasn't soft or feathered like he'd imagined. It was sharp, metallic, and impossibly vast. The edge of the wing brushed against his chest, and the mark burned brighter than ever. Pain shot through his body, and he collapsed to the ground, clutching at the glowing lines spreading across his skin. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the Watcher's unblinking eyes, staring down at him with cold indifference. Samuel woke with a start, gasping for air. He was back in the grass, the night sky above him empty and silent. The Watchers were gone, and the fissure in the earth had vanished, leaving no trace of the chaos that had unfolded. But the mark on his chest still glowed faintly, and the whispers hadn't stopped. They would never stop. When Samuel opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure how long he'd been unconscious. The sky above him was gray, heavy with clouds that churned like a brewing storm. The mark on his chest still burned faintly, a low hum resonating in his bones. His body ached, his limbs weak and trembling, but he forced himself to sit up. The world around him was eerily still. The grass swayed gently in the wind, but there was no sound, no rustling leaves, no chirping birds, no distant hum of life. It was as if the Watchers had drained the air of its vitality, leaving behind an empty, hollow shell of what had once been. Samuel stood, his legs shaking beneath him, and turned in a slow circle. The landscape was unrecognizable. The town he'd grown up in, the familiar landmarks he'd walked past 100 times, they were gone. In their place was a vast, desolate expanse of cracked earth and scattered debris. The air smelled of ash and sulfur, sharp and suffocating. And then he saw it. Far in the distance, a massive figure stood against the horizon, its form silhouetted against the pale light of the sun. It wasn't one of the Watchers. Its body was smaller, more solid, and its wings were tattered and uneven. It stood motionless, its head tilted upward as if staring at the sky. Even from this distance, Samuel could feel its presence, a weight pressing down on his chest. The fallen hadn't been defeated. They had simply moved on. As Samuel trudged forward, his shoes kicking up clouds of dust with every step, he began to hear the whispers again. They were faint at first, like a distant hum, but they grew louder as he drew closer to the figure. The language was alien, the words impossible to understand, but the tone was unmistakable. It wasn't anger or malice, it was grief. The fallen stood at the edge of a massive crater, its jagged wings drooping at its sides. Its body shimmered with an oily black light, and its head hung low as it muttered in its strange, guttural language. Samuel stopped several yards away, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know why he'd come closer. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but something about the creature's posture made him hesitate. It looked defeated. The whispers in Samuel's mind shifted, growing softer, more deliberate. The mark on his chest pulsed faintly, and he felt an inexplicable pull, as though the crater were calling to him. He took a cautious step forward, his breath hitching as the fallen turned its head toward him. Its glowing red eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a sound like grinding metal, the fallen raised one of its jagged wings and pointed toward the center of the crater. Samuel hesitated, his gaze flicking between the creature and the dark abyss before him. The air around the crater felt heavy, charged with a strange, static energy. He could see faint shapes moving within the darkness, shadows that shifted and twisted, their forms indistinct and unnerving. The whispers surged again, louder now, more urgent. "Go. See. Understand." Samuel's legs moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him toward the edge of the crater. The fallen watched him silently, its glowing eyes unblinking as he approached. When he reached the rim, he peered down into the darkness, his stomach churning with dread. The crater was vast, its edges jagged and uneven, as if the earth itself had been torn apart by some great force. At its center was a glowing orb of light, suspended in the air like a miniature sun. It pulsed rhythmically, casting faint shadows that danced across the walls of the crater. The shadows weren't random, they moved with purpose, their forms coalescing into fleeting images before dissipating again. Samuel squinted, his heart racing as he realized what he was seeing. The shadows were visions. He saw cities crumbling into dust, rivers running red with blood, and skies filled with winged figures. He saw the Watchers descending, their golden eyes blazing as they tore through the earth with precision and indifference. He saw humanity scattered, broken, and silent. And then he saw himself. The image was brief, but it was enough. He saw himself standing at the center of the chaos, the mark on his chest burning brighter than the sun. The Watchers surrounded him, their wings folding inward as if bowing. The Fallen circled him, their jagged forms shimmering with dark light. And above it all, a single voice echoed through the air, cold and unrelenting. The balance must be maintained. Samuel stumbled back from the edge of the crater, his breath coming in short gasps. The Fallen watched him silently, its glowing eyes narrowing as if to measure his reaction. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. "Do you see? Do you understand? There is no escape." Samuel shook his head, his hands trembling. "No," he whispered. "I don't understand. Why are you showing me this?" The Fallen didn't answer. It simply turned its gaze back to the glowing orb, its wings folding inward as it knelt at the edge of the crater. Samuel stared at it, his chest tightening as the realization began to sink in. The Watchers weren't here to save humanity. The Fallen weren't here to destroy it. They were both part of something far greater, something Samuel couldn't begin to comprehend. And he was at the center of it. As he turned to leave, the ground beneath him trembled again. The hum of the glowing orb grew louder, its light intensifying until it illuminated the entire crater. The air crackled with energy, and Samuel felt the mark on his chest burn hotter, its glow searing through his shirt. He turned back toward the crater just in time to see the shadows rise. They moved like smoke, spiraling upward from the orb in thick, twisting tendrils. The Fallen stood, its wings spreading wide as the shadows enveloped it, their dark light merging with its form. The whispers in Samuel's mind became a deafening roar, their meaning finally clear. "The balance is broken. They will come." Samuel took a step back, his body trembling as the shadows surged toward him. He turned and ran, the whispers chasing him into the desolate expanse. But no matter how far he ran, he couldn't escape the truth. They were coming, and there was nothing he could do to stop them. Samuel ran until his legs could no longer carry him. His lungs burned with every breath, his body screaming for rest, but the shadows behind him were relentless. The landscape around him was a barren, cracked wasteland, with no signs of life or shelter. The sky above churned with black clouds, glowing faintly with streaks of gold and red, as though torn apart by the Watcher's presence. He stumbled to the ground, collapsing in exhaustion. The whispers had faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavy in the air. But the mark on his chest still pulsed, its rhythm growing faster, as if in time with the danger approaching. Samuel turned his head and looked back the way he had come. The shadows had stopped following him, but they hadn't disappeared. They coiled at the horizon like a living storm, writhing and shifting as they consumed the land. The Fallen were there, their jagged wings slicing through the dark haze as they moved with unnatural grace. And behind them, towering above the chaos, were the Watchers. Their golden eyes pierced through the storm, unblinking and cold. They didn't move, but their presence alone was enough to make the ground tremble. Samuel could feel their gaze on him, heavy and all-consuming, as though they were dissecting him piece by piece. "You cannot run." The voice thundered in his mind, loud and absolute, more powerful than the whispers. Samuel flinched, clutching his head as the words reverberated through his skull. "You are marked." Samuel pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. "What do you want from me?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Why are you doing this?" The sky above him split open. A massive, jagged tear appeared in the clouds, glowing with an intense golden light. The Watchers began to move, their forms shifting and twisting as they descended toward the earth. Their wings stretched endlessly, blotting out what little light remained. The hum that accompanied them grew louder, vibrating through the air and the ground, making Samuel's teeth rattle. The Watchers didn't land. They hovered above the earth, their forms impossibly vast and incomprehensible. One of them extended a hand, if it could be called a hand, toward Samuel. It was translucent and shimmering, like molten glass, with countless fingers that stretched and curled unnaturally. The mark on Samuel's chest burned brighter as the hand drew closer. "The balance must be restored," the voice said, resonating from the Watchers and the sky itself. "You are the vessel." Samuel stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. "I don't understand. What balance? What vessel?" The Watchers didn't answer. Instead, the mark on his chest began to expand, the glowing lines spreading across his skin like cracks in glass. He screamed as the burning sensation intensified, dropping to his knees as the light enveloped him. The air around him warped, distorting the landscape and pulling at his very being. And then they arrived. The Fallen surged forward, breaking through the storm of shadows. They didn't attack this time. They knelt, their jagged wings folding as they bowed before the Watchers. Their red eyes glowed faintly, filled with a strange mix of defiance and submission. The tension in the air was suffocating, the two sides locked in a silent standoff as Samuel knelt at the center of it all. The largest Watcher, its golden eyes burning brighter than the sun, spoke again. "You are the key." Samuel gasped, his body convulsing as the light from the mark engulfed him completely. He could feel something inside him changing, a force far beyond his understanding taking hold. Images flooded his mind, visions of the past, the present, and a future that seemed impossible. He saw civilizations rise and fall, humanity teetering on the edge of destruction, and the Watchers standing silently above it all. And then he saw the truth. The Watchers weren't protectors or destroyers. They were enforcers, caretakers of a balance so ancient and vast that humanity was nothing more than a fleeting spark within it. The Fallen weren't rebels. They were failures, beings who had tried and failed to carry out the Watcher's will. And now, Samuel had been chosen to take their place. "No," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't. I won't." The Watchers' light intensified, their voices booming in unison. "The balance is broken. It must be restored." The mark on his chest flared one final time, and the world around him dissolved into white. When Samuel opened his eyes, he was no longer in the wasteland. He stood in the golden expanse once more, the light blinding and cold. The Watchers surrounded him, their forms towering and incomprehensible. The Fallen were there too, their jagged figures kneeling at the edges of the light, their wings folded in submission. Samuel felt the weight of their gaze, the combined presence of their ancient, unfathomable will pressing down on him. He looked down at his chest, expecting to see the mark, but it was gone. In its place was a faint, golden glow that seemed to pulse in time with the Watcher's hum. "The vessel is prepared," the voice said. "The balance will be restored." Samuel shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "I don't want this. I didn't ask for this." "It is not your choice," the voice replied. "You are the key. You are the bridge." The ground beneath him began to tremble, cracks spreading through the golden expanse. The Watchers raised their wings, their forms shifting as the light around them grew brighter. The Fallen stood, their eyes fixed on Samuel as the shadows began to rise once more. And then the trumpet sounded. The sound was deafening, a single, piercing note that resonated through the expanse and beyond. Samuel felt it in every fiber of his being, a vibration that tore through his body and mind. The Watchers moved in unison, their wings folding inward as they ascended into the blinding light. The Fallen followed, their jagged forms disappearing into the shadows. Samuel was left alone, standing in the middle of the crumbling expanse. The trumpet's note lingered, echoing through the void as the light began to fade. He fell to his knees, his body trembling as the truth of his role sank in. He wasn't a savior. He wasn't a hero. He was a vessel, a bridge between forces far beyond his understanding. And the balance was about to be restored. Samuel woke to find himself standing in a world that was both familiar and alien. The golden expanse was gone, replaced by an eerily quiet landscape. It was his town, or what was left of it. The streets were cracked, buildings stood as empty shells, and the air felt thick, heavy, almost unbreathable. A pale, grayish light filtered through a clouded sky, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to move when he wasn't looking. The mark on his chest was gone, but the faint golden glow beneath his skin lingered, pulsing like a second heartbeat. Samuel stumbled forward, his legs weak, his body aching as though it had been stretched too far and barely put back together. He didn't know how much time had passed or where the Watchers had gone. All he knew was that something had changed. The balance had shifted, and he was still here, for now. He made his way through the desolate streets, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of metal or the distant rustle of wind. It wasn't until he reached the town square that he realized he wasn't alone. Figures were scattered throughout the square, some kneeling, others standing motionless. At first, Samuel thought they were people, survivors like him. But as he drew closer, he saw that their forms were wrong. Their bodies were twisted and elongated, their faces devoid of features. They shimmered faintly, their edges blurring like images on a screen struggling to stay in focus. They were the remnants of something. Echoes of people who had been caught in the Watcher's wake. Samuel's breath quickened as he backed away, his gaze darting to the largest figure in the square. It stood taller than the others, its form more solid but no less distorted. Its head turned toward him, and though it had no eyes, he could feel its gaze boring into him. The whispers returned, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Restore. Balance. Begin again. Samuel clenched his fists, his heart pounding. He didn't understand what they wanted from him, but he knew he couldn't stay here. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the empty streets as the whispers followed him, growing louder with every step. It wasn't long before Samuel reached the edge of town. The open fields that once surrounded it were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of cracked earth. The horizon was obscured by a thick haze, and the air smelled of ash and decay. But there, in the distance, something moved. A group of people, or what looked like people, was gathered around a massive figure that loomed over them. It was a Watcher, its golden eyes glowing faintly as it stood motionless. The group knelt before it, their heads bowed in what looked like prayer. Samuel's stomach turned. He didn't want to get any closer, but something about the scene drew him in. He approached cautiously, staying low as he crept toward the group. As he drew closer, he realized they weren't praying, they were weeping. Their cries were soft but anguished, a collective sound of despair that sent chills down his spine. The Watcher didn't move. It simply stood there, its towering form radiating an oppressive energy. The people seemed oblivious to Samuel's presence, their focus entirely on the being before them. But then, without warning, the Watcher turned its head. Its golden eyes locked onto Samuel, and the whispers in his mind exploded into a deafening roar. You cannot deny it. You are the bridge. The balance must be restored. The people froze, their cries silenced as they turned to look at Samuel. Their faces were gaunt, hollow, their eyes glassy and lifeless. One by one, they rose to their feet and began to walk toward him, their movements slow and deliberate. Samuel backed away, his pulse racing. No, he muttered, his voice trembling. I'm not part of this. But the people didn't stop. Their blank faces and lifeless eyes bore into him, their movements eerily synchronized. The Watcher remained still, its presence an unyielding weight that pressed down on Samuel's chest. He turned and ran. The haze thickened as Samuel fled, his lungs burning with every breath. He didn't know where he was going, there was nowhere to go, but he couldn't stop. The whispers were everywhere now, louder and more insistent, overlapping in a cacophony of demands. Restore the balance. Fulfill your purpose. There is no escape. The ground beneath him trembled, and he stumbled, falling hard onto the cracked earth. He gasped for air, his vision swimming as the whispers reached a crescendo. And then, everything went still. When he looked up, the Watcher was there. It loomed over him, its golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. Its wings unfurled, stretching impossibly wide, blotting out the dim light of the sky. The hum returned, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through Samuel's very bones. "You cannot run," the voice said, cold and absolute. "The balance must be restored." Samuel struggled to his feet, his body trembling. "I didn't ask for this," he shouted. "I didn't choose this." "It is not your choice," the voice replied. "It is your purpose." The Watcher extended one of its many hands, its translucent fingers curling toward Samuel. The mark on his chest flared to life, its glow searing through his shirt. Samuel cried out as the light enveloped him, his body convulsing as the world around him dissolved into white. When the light faded, Samuel was standing in the golden expanse once more. The Watchers surrounded him, their forms towering and radiant. The whispers were gone, replaced by a profound, deafening silence. "The balance is restored," the voice said. "The cycle begins anew." Samuel looked down at his hands, his chest, his body. The mark was gone, but he felt different, emptier, as though a piece of himself had been taken and replaced with something else. He turned his gaze to the Watchers, his voice trembling as he asked, "What happens now?" The Watchers didn't answer. They simply stood there, their golden eyes unblinking as the light around them grew brighter. Samuel felt the ground beneath him shift, the golden expanse cracking and splintering as the light consumed everything. And then there was nothing. When Samuel opened his eyes, he was lying in the grass, the sky above him blue and clear. Birds chirped in the distance, and the air was warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. It was as though nothing had happened, as though the Watchers, the fallen, and the golden expanse had been nothing more than a dream. But Samuel knew better. He could still feel the faint hum in his chest, the weight of the Watcher's gaze lingering in the back of his mind. The balance had been restored, but he wasn't free. He never would be. Somewhere, in the distance, a faint whisper echoed in his mind. "It is not over." The words froze him in place, his breath catching in his throat. He turned, expecting to see one of the Watchers towering behind him, but there was nothing. The meadow stretched on, uninterrupted, the silence broken only by the faint rustling of the grass. Yet, the whisper lingered in his mind, circling like a predator. Samuel took another step, and the earth beneath him trembled. The sky above darkened, the once brilliant blue shifting to an unnatural gray. The hum grew louder, deeper, resonating through his chest and bones. He fell to his knees, clutching his head as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "The balance is restored. The cycle begins anew. You are the key." The ground cracked beneath him, golden light seeping through the fractures. Samuel gasped as the light enveloped him, its warmth soothing yet overwhelming. Images flashed through his mind. Cities rising, civilizations flourishing, and then crumbling into dust. It was endless, a loop without escape, and he was trapped at its center. When the light faded, Samuel was alone again. The sky was blue, the meadow untouched. But he could still feel it, the Watcher's gaze, distant but unrelenting. He wasn't free. He never would be. As he walked through the endless meadow, the whispers echoed faintly in his mind, a constant reminder of the truth he could never escape. And somewhere, far beyond the horizon, they were still watching.